I wanted to talk today about the empath story. So we all have the experience or the ability to be empathic. It's part of the human experience. Even people that seem like they have no capacity for empathy still have that human capacity in them somewhere. The way that our empathy usually develops is from having some kind of a wounding experience, whether this is a major trauma or a small, what can feel as an adult feel like a small trauma as a young person is still a big thing. It still affects our energy and our field and what happens to us. So when we have this wounding experience, we experience something as being bad. And in our effort to not want to have this experience again, what we do to keep ourselves safe is we actually end up extending our energy out in an effort to avoid that happening again. So we all can be empathetic. We can all have the capacity for empathy. And then for those of us who experience being an empath, what happens is that empathy goes one step further. And so instead of just being able to understand somebody else's experience, we usually feel it in our own body, right? And in this experience, in addition to extending our energy out so that we don't have to have a bad experience again, we also extend our desires for other people to not have a bad experience. And when this happens, what happens as a consequence of this is we actually end up kind of like putting trackers out there in other people's energy. And so when this happens, it can be challenging for us to navigate what is ours and what is others. Having this ability, again, is actually a human capacity. And it is also a gift. And like any gift or any capacity that we can have the wounded version and the conscious version. So the gift is that we can feel, which is one of the things that we came here to do as humans, is to feel everything, right? The shadow, the downside or the wound is sometimes feeling for others. So in our experience as an empath, we can have two versions. So there is the experience of having a wound, which makes you an empath. And then there's making your empathy a wound, having your empathy become a wound to yourself and your experience. So what we want to do when we navigate this, or we learn that this is part of our experience, is work through how to do a few things. Part of the undoing of the burden of being an empath is learning to track our energy versus others' energy, having healthy boundaries, being okay with discomfort, our own or other people's, which even other people's discomfort as an empath often feels like our own discomfort. And then from there, we can move to having this experience of feeling like it's a wound, to having the experience of ourselves in our wholeness and seeing the gift and the abilities that we have. So let's start with tracking our energy. When we are attuned to the collective field, this includes other people's energy and feelings. Again, here the gift is that we can be tuned into the field and everything that's happening. What happens is it becomes a shadow when we place our attunement, our ability to pick up on this as our job to manage everything in the field. And that's when it becomes a burden that we carry. But it's actually not our job to change other people so that we can feel safe. Our job is actually to give ourselves our own safety. Safety is a feeling. And so when we take responsibility for another, we're actually, in some ways, blocking their ability to take responsibility for themselves. It's usually done in, in a compassionate sense. We mean well when we do this, and things can start to get muddy. So then it's like, well, is this my energy or your energy? And we start to feel other people's stuff, and we get kind of burdened by that. And so what we're actually being called to do is to shift from being externally oriented in all of the feelings that are around us to becoming internally oriented. And so what is helpful here is to be in the question of what is in the greater service to the field. Many of those that have experienced the empath path often find themselves in a story with narcissists or people that have really amazing boundaries, people that are especially in their center. When we have this experience, of course, there are layers to the experience. So oftentimes it might turn out to feel like an abusive or toxic relationship, and probably is at the beginning stage. And this is where it can be kind of tricky. This is where we can end up staying in the story of our wound or moving to the other side, to the conscious version of the gift that we carry. So when we have this empath narcissist relationship, it's not that both parties actually have medicine for each other. And it's not that narcissists are bad and they need to change. It's actually that narcissists need to learn how to be more like empaths, and empaths actually have to learn how to be more like narcissists. And I know that's a hard thing for us to hear, and a lot of us put up our wall right away with like, no, but that's bad to be like that. But let's explore this a little bit more. The longer we cling to the idea of good and bad, the longer we actually experience this to be true. And so the longer we have this experience of some things being good or bad, or some people being good or bad, what we're actually doing is drawing in an experience to solidify our belief that we are good and they are bad. Where someone like a narcissist can have medicine for us as empaths is narcissists actually have excellent boundaries. They are actually completely centered in themselves. Now, sometimes that looks like being self-centered. A lot of times it looks like being self-centered, but there's actually a difference. So what often happens is we get into these relationships and we're trying to discern what's ours. Oftentimes we place responsibility on wanting to make someone else better, even if they're not a narcissist. Anybody that we see as having some wounds that we feel, we don't want them to have that experience, right? Again, it's coming from this heart-centered place. We want them to feel better. And so when we take ownership of wanting to fix that for someone, what we're also doing is kind of taking responsibility for them getting better. And when we have that frame that there's something wrong and they need to get better, what it does is reinforce for them that they are bad. And then this causes this mechanism in them to actually respond or maybe react by wanting to fight that. So we get kind of this like spot where we're locked in. And then the power dynamics repeat. And again, it's not that it's a one or the other thing. There's this gray area in the middle. And actually where both parties are striving for is this middle ground. So two things can happen when we cling to this story. We can either keep repeating the pattern, trying to escape it, trying to prove that we are good and they are bad, which is just going to invite in an experience of feeling badness. Or if we're still locked into this story, the other thing that might happen is we might find ourselves in a reverse situation next, where actually we're the one that is in the relationship as being bad. Maybe the other person has trouble saying what they need, and so we get frustrated with that, and then we end up, reacting, and so now all of a sudden the story is flipped. And this happens so that we can experience the other side of our empathy, right? And as long as we judge someone else, we're actually creating an opportunity to become that other. And so here we can talk about how our empathy can actually be translated to compassion. We don't actually need to fix someone else or make them better. And it's actually nobody else's job to make us feel safe. That's our job for ourselves. So this is where boundaries come in, right? So what we want to start with is tracking our own energy. So when we are having what feel like bad or negative experiences in our own system, we want to first look at, are they mine? And there's lots of tools that we can use to do this, but one of the most direct ways is just to ask ourselves that. Is this mine? If you're having trouble getting a clear answer, because sometimes it's not clear. Sometimes you're experiencing both. You're experiencing both the feelings that somebody else is going through, and we might have somewhere in our system where we're matching that feeling. So I like to kind of follow my awareness. When I ask myself that question, is this mine? What comes up? So we might have a clear answer right away. No, it might be, no, this isn't mine. This belongs to someone else, right? And there's a way we can kind of like allow that to exit our system and kind of return it back to the person that it belongs to. The other thing that can happen is maybe some of it is ours. And so then we have the opportunity to sort of follow that pathway and see where it's connected to. What is the experience that's coming up for me? Maybe a past experience that's showing up right now for me to look at and to heal. Because empaths are oriented, generally speaking, externally and towards compassion, oftentimes we will place other people's experience above our own experience. So we sort of vacate ourselves to make other people feel better. And again, this is where we come back to this medicine piece where actually, if we want to, the most direct route in helping other people is to help ourselves. And the more we are in our own fullness and centered in ourselves, the more we become, the example for other people to follow. So this might look like doing things like expressing how we truly feel. It might look like getting in touch with our sacred no. It might look like not intervening when somebody is asking for help. And so this is where we can move into our next phase, which is getting comfortable with discomfort. Not vacating ourselves because it feels safer to not be in ourselves, right? So there's a few layers here. Part of being empathic is feeling. And the reason that we are given feelings are to feel them. And so this means not just the good ones. This means all of the feelings. So when we have an experience, allowing ourselves to just be with that experience and be with that feeling. The feeling is not who you are. You actually can't be overtaken by a feeling unless we try to block the feeling from moving through us. Feeling is emotion. It's energy in motion. So it's energy moving through us. And so when we decide that there are some feelings that are good and some feelings that are bad, we tend to try to stop the bad feelings versus just letting ourselves feel it. So when we are feeling discomfort, what we are being called to do is to actually just let it move through us, to be okay being uncomfortable. Maybe you say no to somebody and they don't like it. And that's not actually your energy to tend, that's theirs to tend. Your job is to be in your own center and stay in your own truth. And what can happen here is, especially when we are really sensitive, is we can start to feel attacked by other people's energy. And when this happens, we start to create a prison within ourselves of all of these feelings. So we want to find healthy ways to let the feelings pass through us, having a practice to move the energy. So this can be something like journaling, like putting that energy into an object and burying or burning it. This can look like dancing, like yoga, like singing, or maybe yelling. Ultimately, what is helpful is to have some private time to process this energy, to let it move through us, and to allow ourselves to just be with the experience. From here, I like to bring in the tool of mindfulness. So when I hold a boundary on something that I know is true for me, and I start to get a little squirmy in the discomfort of maybe somebody not liking it or being unhappy with the result, or maybe they feel uncomfortable with the answer that I gave, this is a place where we often retreat. It gets really uncomfortable for us, so we start to backpedal, and then we, dissolve our boundaries, and then we're wide open again. So where you can use mindfulness here is to remember that actually what's in the highest service is to stay in your center and be in your own truth. And when we vacate that, everything in the field gets a little bit more confusing, right? So in those moments of wanting to backpedal, I like to remind myself, this is the fear of illusion that I'm looking at right now, that the discomfort is somehow bad, and it's not. It's just a feeling. Often we feel other people's feelings as a way to stay connected. But when we do this, we actually connect to other people through suffering instead of through the path of self-actualization. So giving ourselves permission to be in our own experience allows us to connect in a deeper way to other people, because then we're actually connecting from our authentic self rather than trying to connect through this pathway of shared suffering. And when we jump into suffering with someone else, we actualize that experience. So giving ourselves permission to live alongside the suffering and not necessarily have to embody it and make it the story and the truth. And then this allows other people to see that it's possible to not live in suffering and make their own decisions for themselves to move beyond the suffering as well. So the other piece that can get sticky here is, again, coming back to the two ways that we might experience the empath story. And often many of us experience them both at the same time. So there's the piece where the wound allows us to become empathic. And then there's the piece where our empathy becomes the wound. And when we get really locked into this story where it feels like other people's energy is an attack on us, if we don't have these boundaries, these energetic boundaries even, a lot of the time what we do as a result is we try to create boundaries by creating space. So this looks like, separating ourselves or isolating ourselves, which can be a helpful tool. This is important. There's nothing wrong with doing this. It is definitely an important stage. And if we're beginning to explore where our boundaries are and what feelings are ours and what are others, then this might be a really great first step to kind of physically remove ourselves from a situation so we can come back to our center and tune back into ourselves and what we're actually feeling and what we're actually experiencing. Regroup, get in touch with our power, and then, go back out there again. However, we don't want to make a habit of this. When we make a habit of this again begins to reinforce the story that we're caught up in. So when we try to hold our boundaries by removing ourselves from a situation or creating space, often we end up becoming more sensitive because now we haven't had boundaries. Now we've only been protecting ourselves by creating space. So then when we try to go back out into the world, there's no boundary there and everything feels more intense, right? The other place that can be tricky here is coming back to this idea of the story that I'm good and you're bad. What that does is try to create a boundary by making a wall, by saying you're bad. And again, in order for us to make sure that that story is true, that means we have to have the experience of other people doing bad things to reinforce that we're right, right? So removing ourselves from this story of good and bad is the medicine here. And seeing the other as having medicine for us and a teaching for us that we can learn from. And ideally, the other people might learn from us too, but that's not our job to make sure that happens. I speak a lot about the difference between change and transformation. And change has the energetic of saying where you are or what you're doing is wrong and we need it fixed. Transformation is completing a cycle of a past and beginning a new cycle. So this is a helpful tool to keep in mind when you're navigating these tricky spots. Now, I do want to back up a little bit. And of course, if you're in a situation that's harmful or violent, you should go. You don't actually have to compassion your way through it or spiritualize your way through it. You are allowed to leave. In fact, that might be what you're being invited to do, is to learn to have some boundaries. So there's this other side of the story that sometimes looks like it is true. Every experience that we have on some level, we're in agreement with. And we can go the other way and start to blame ourselves from that experience. But blame is illusion. Blame is also not real, right? Nobody's actually at fault. Fault is not real. So here we are, giving ourselves permission to be in our center and be in our truth and leave if we must, and then learn to find out what our actual truth is and then re-enter. The last piece I want to talk to today is also part of the stages of the empath story. So when we first realize that we are empaths, that we feel for other people, this can be kind of exciting. It kind of feels like a superpower. Actually, I mean, it kind of is. And actually, it can be developed. It's not who you are. It's a part of the human capacity. So people can learn how to become an empath. When we attach to the fact that we're empaths makes us special, then we get caught in the wounded version of being the empath again. Then we come into the story that we are somehow a victim to this thing, or that we have something that other people don't have. But all people actually do have this dial for empathy. It's just that some of us have it turned way up, like way the fuck up, and others have it turned all the way off. And so even though it's kind of counterintuitive, one of the best ways to become free from the burdens of the empath story is to actually detach from the idea that being empathetic makes us special. You actually you don't need any qualities to make you special. because you're already unique. You're already unique. You already have a unique blueprint and a unique medicine. And you've come here with a specific set of experiences and teachings to share with others. Now, having empathy can be a gift because oftentimes we find ourselves being able to use it to help other people. And this is why a lot of empaths end up becoming healers and coaches, because they can use that as a tool to help others show the way when they have permission to do it. Right? So we can use this as part of our story that makes us unique, but being an empath is not who you are. You're more than that, right? And so if we can actually let go of being an empath makes us special, we are able to open the gift up even more and be able to use it in service instead of becoming a slave to the overwhelming feelings we sometimes feel. And so if you're finding yourself somewhere in the story, and oftentimes we go through multiple layers of a story, we're kind of moving in a spiral all the time. So it might look like learning the first few stages, learning what energy is ours and what energy is others, and how to track that, and how to bring our energy back to ourselves so we're not caught up in somebody else's experience. Sometimes having sometimes tracking other people's experience feels cool because it feels like we know some things, right? And this can be a bypass for doing our own work. When we're caught up in helping other people or saving other people, it means we're not working on ourselves. So our job is to track our own energy and become responsible for our own feelings and learning to give ourselves safety. And then from there, we learn how to put up healthy boundaries and how to stick to them. And we're not going to get it just right away. It might take a few tries. It might take years of learning how to put up a boundary and stick to it. And then maybe sometimes we drop our boundaries and we agree to something that we don't want, and then we have a lesson, we learn something, and we come back and we try again, right? And each time it's a teaching. And then from there, we practice being okay with discomfort. And choosing to let feelings move through us without having to believe that we are the feelings that are happening, that are moving through us. And in this process, we release ourselves from the story of I'm good and you're bad, or I'm special and you're not, or I'm light and you're dark. And the more we do this, the more we move from the experiencing the empath story as a wound to getting to experience it in this wholeness and being able to use that in service to the higher good, right? And so with almost all things, what we come back to is learning to be in our center and trusting ourselves. And I use this analogy a lot. So as we are remembering ourselves and our wholeness, I like to imagine humanity as a big puzzle, right? And so we're all a unique puzzle piece. And if we're trying to be a different shape, and that might look like accommodating somebody else that you don't want to accommodate or dropping your boundaries to escape feeling uncomfortable, that's when we sort of change our shape. And if we are not in our shape, our unique being, then the other pieces actually can't fit around us either. And then everybody becomes off-centered and the cycle repeats. So the invitation is to have a practice of tracking your energy, seeing what's yours and what's not. Listening to your deeper self and what your truth is and where your boundaries actually are. And then getting okay with discomfort and moving beyond the story of good and bad so that we can become whole again. Yeah, so a lot of good stuff in here. And I do want to come back around to that this is actually a gift. So you can use it in service. And it works best in service when we are honoring ourselves first, right? Fill our own cup first. So that is what I have for you today. If you have thoughts or questions kind of coming up around this stuff, you're welcome to share or ask in our group. And, you know, I invite you to continue to explore this for yourself, to explore where you've been maybe in the story and where you are in moving beyond the story, so that we can use these tools as a gift and in service to the greater good. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye for now.